you understand that. Senator Vance, Ohio.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the six of you for being willing to serve. I want to direct my questions to Commissioner Uyeda. In particular, you have written and said some interesting things about BlackRock and some of the large institutional asset managers, and I just want to sort of talk about that and talk about why I find it concerning and why I think the SEC has a very, very important role here in monitoring the way in which these massive financial conglomerates have effectively consolidated, but also used that consolidation to push a certain political view into our economy. To underscore this point, in 2022, Berkshire Hathaway's Charlie Munger, of course, one of the most famous investors of the last 50 years, observed that we have a new bunch of emperors, and they're the people who vote the shares in index funds. I think a lot of Americans, of course, own shares in index funds. They don't necessarily realize that when they hand their money over to an index fund, they're handing their money over to a very active political participant in our economy. And it's something that I think this committee, we should spend a lot of time on in the coming years. But Munger was specifically referencing the, quote, big three asset managers. Could you just highlight why are they the big three? Who are the big three?
With respect, I believe Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street are among the big three. There are a number of other big asset managers too, although I don't have the specific assets under management.
Yeah. So my staff has compiled that information for me. I'm sure you're not surprised by this, but these three asset managers control the three largest index funds. Together, they manage around $20 trillion in assets, an extraordinary amount of assets that they control. Accounts for about 34% of all mutual fund assets as of 2015. They market their funds as passive or as index tracking. In other words, if you sign up for an index fund, you don't think that you're signing up for an active participant in the market. But I'm curious, Mr. Uyeda, I mean, is that actually accurate? When the American people think that they're giving their money over to an index fund and it's just going to track the general trajectory of the stock market, is that actually what happens, or do these index funds participate a little bit more aggressively in the management of some of these companies?
Well, Senator Vance, I would distinguish between the fund itself and the advisor. The fund itself, investors are very much looking to something that tracks very closely. In fact, that's one of the criteria you would look at is how closely does the return track the underlying index. The managers themselves have voting power, not only of the assets that are held in the index funds, but any other assets that manager oversees, whether it's a collective investment trust, actively managed fund, separately managed account, and so on.
And am I right that they use their power as massive institutional investors to effectively direct stewardship activities, right? And this is the way in which they sort of use and infect their own politics into the management of some of these companies?
Yes, Senator, that's correct. A lot of the advisors put out their stewardship policies and promote that.
So here's what I find a little bit weird, right? So there are 13D and 13G disclosures, okay? These index funds, which of these do they file and why do they file those?
My observation is most file on Schedule 13G for a passive investor.
So and 13G allows them to avoid disclosure of a lot of their activities, right? So there are a lot of things that you don't have to put in a 13G that you would have to put in a 13D. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do we think that sometimes their activities rise to the level of actually statutorily requiring them to do a 13D disclosure?
That would be a concern. It's a facts and circumstance basis to the extent that one is trying to influence control over an issuer, and you can oftentimes do that with a very large stockholder. That raises questions whether you ought to be filing on 13D rather than 13G.
Yeah, and I'm mindful of my time running short here, so I'll cut this off now. But something I'd like to work with you, Mr. Uyeda, and my staff here is if they should be filing much more substantive disclosures that actually give the American people insight into how $20 trillion of their money is being spent, and yet they're filing a 13G disclosure, that probably means there's something going on. I don't want to put my tinfoil hat on here too much. Sometimes I do that in the banking committee and the chairman gets mad at me, but I really worry that there's a massive part of the American economy that lays hidden from the American consumers and from the lawmakers who represent them, that maybe something is something we should look at. Thank you.
Senator Vance, I can't think of when I was mad at you. So, Senator Menendez is recognized from New Jersey.